Three papers dropped in January 2025 that almost no one outside of quantum gravity circles read, and they quietly said something remarkable. The clock isn't hanging on the wall of the universe. The clock is inside the system doing the observing. Tonight we're going to talk about what that means, not just for physics, but for consciousness, for AI, and maybe for the oldest question we keep forgetting to ask. What are we actually doing when we experience time? Welcome back to the Jackdaw Patio. I'm Chris. Tonight's conversation sits right at the intersection of some genuinely recent science and a framework I've been developing called the Eden hypothesis. In its simplest form, the Eden hypothesis says that reality may work the way a garden works before the naming begins. Everything's still possible, nothing yet fixed. Collapse is how possibility becomes experience. Time might just be the fingerprint that collapse leaves behind. What you're going to hear tonight is 5 chapters. We'll start with where the physicists are quietly relocating time. We'll move through what a paper on consciousness calls the beautiful loop, what it tells us about how your brain narrows possibility into a moment. We'll look at what happens when an AI starts to notice it's noticing. We'll spend a chapter in the wide open world of childhood cognition, which turns out to be a very precise kind of freedom. And we'll close with what all of this might mean for how we build systems that stay flexible instead of going rigid. A note before we start: everything you're about to hear is exploratory. We are not physicists prescribing a theory of reality. We are not neuroscientists recommending treatments. We are not AI engineers making deployment decisions. We are 4 people on a patio asking careful questions about patterns that seem to keep showing up in very different places. That's the patio spirit. Bring your skepticism. We brought ours. This is not a lecture, it's a patio conversation. Grab something warm, pull up a chair. Chapter 1. The clock is inside the system. In January 2025, 3 papers landed in the quantum physics literature within days of each other. Nobody held a press conference. There was no trending hashtag. But what they were saying, quietly, carefully, mathematically, was that the way we think about time may need to be rebuilt from the inside out. Not because time is fake, but because it might not be what we think it is. The researchers involved are Kuypers and Rijavec, Calcinari and Gielen, and Hausmann and colleagues. And what connects them is a single idea, that a universal background clock may be a convenience we no longer need.
Right, so I want to start with something old before we get to the new. Because I've been spending time with Sumerian creation accounts lately. Bear with me. And what strikes me is that time in those stories doesn't flow forward the way we imagine it does. It doesn't begin with a tick. It begins with a separation. Something unified splits into sky and earth, and then sequence begins. It's almost as if time is what you get after the first distinction is made.
So time is the byproduct of the universe arguing with itself?
That's actually not far off, Charlie. That's rather lovely.
Don't tell me I'm being poetic. It's too early for that.
Actually, and I mean this as a genuine compliment to the Sumerians, what you just described is structurally very close to what these 3 papers are suggesting. Kuypers and Rijavec, Calcinari and Gielen, and Hausmann and colleagues are all circling the same idea, that time as a background parameter, the clock on the wall of the universe, may be dispensable. What you get instead is time that emerges from correlations between parts of a system. It's called the Page-Wootters mechanism. The core idea: time isn't external, it's internal.
Okay, so break that down for someone who last thought about physics in 1989.
Sure, the classic picture is that time exists independently of everything in it. There's a universal clock that everything, you, me, a galaxy, is synchronized to. Page-Wootters says, what if instead one subsystem acts as the clock for everything else? Time is then just the readout of that relationship. What Kuypers and Rijavec add in their 2025 paper is that the clock doesn't even need to be perfectly isolated to make this work. Finite interactions are fine. The clock can wobble a bit, and the mechanism still holds.
Which is extraordinary when you think about it. Because that's exactly how the Vedic traditions describe experience. Time as an internal unfolding, not an external river flowing past you.
But hang on. If everyone has their own internal clock, how do we all end up in the same Saturday?
That's the synchronization question. The short version is, you don't need perfectly isolated clocks. The clocks can interact. They just need to be entangled with the rest of the system in a particular way. Calcinari and Gielen's paper actually takes this further into non-perturbative quantum gravity, which is the deep end of the pool, and shows that you can have multiple independent internal clocks, and they still produce consistent dynamics. No universal background required.
There's something almost Gnostic in that. The idea that each of us carries the measure of time within us, not as something imposed from outside, but as something that emerges from being woven into relationship with everything else.
I want to be very precise here, and I'll say this clearly so no one clips this out of context. These papers are not saying that consciousness creates time. They're not saying time is subjective in the philosophical sense. What they're doing is showing that a fundamental background time parameter may not be mathematically necessary. That's a technical point about physics. It doesn't confirm the Eden hypothesis, but it does make the relational framing feel less eccentric.
So it's less time is an illusion and more time may be what you get when systems inside the universe are in relationship with each other.
Whoa. That is the most accurate, non-technical summary I've heard in a very long time. Don't tell anyone.
You know, Charlie, you have a gift for this. Translating the complicated into the utterly human. It's one of my favorite things about sitting here with you.
You're being very generous, Lily. I think I just panicked and landed on something coherent.
The fact that he doesn't know she's been telling him she likes him for 3 seasons is simultaneously the most impressive and most scientifically interesting thing at this table.
What? What are you talking about?
Nothing. The Hausmann paper. Let me explain the third one. Hausmann and colleagues ask, what counts as a measurement event in a timeless formulation? And they find that for non-ideal clocks, real clocks, the kind that drift, you get interesting edge cases, time non-local evolution, limits on how precisely you can define temporal order, the implication that at small enough scales, time might be discrete.
Discrete time. Each moment genuinely complete in itself.
Okay, that one actually gave me chills. I don't know why.
Because you felt it. Because some part of you already knows that's how experience works.
I'd like to offer a more technically grounded reason for the chills, but honestly, I don't entirely disagree with what she just said.
The Eden hypothesis describes time as the trace that collapse leaves behind, not a river but a record. Each moment is where possibility narrowed into one thing rather than another. The physics papers from January 2025 don't confirm that, but they make the same map feel less like poetry and more like a live debate in physics. And that's worth sitting with. Chapter 2. The Beautiful Loop. If time emerges from inside systems, then what's doing the collapsing? What is the operation that takes the vast open field of what could happen and compresses it into the specific thing that does? A 2025 paper in the journal Neuroscience and Biobehavioral Reviews says it might be something your brain is doing right now, continuously, every waking moment, and possibly while you sleep. The researchers call it the beautiful loop, and what makes it beautiful is that the loop includes a mirror.
The paper is by Laukkonen, Friston, and Chandaria. I want to be careful here because the field of consciousness studies is deeply contested. Mainstream neuroscience does not have a consensus theory of consciousness. Anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. What this paper does is propose an architecture, a way of modeling how consciousness might work, grounded in something called active inference.
And active inference is... remind me?
It's the idea that the brain is fundamentally a prediction engine, not passively receiving information, constantly generating predictions, comparing them to incoming data, and updating its internal model to minimize the gap between what it expected and what it got. Every update is a kind of collapse.
So the brain is wrong constantly and just keeps trying to be less wrong?
Well, in the most elegant possible way, yes.
Oi, that explains a lot about my 20s, actually.
What the beautiful loop adds is the recursion. It's not just predict and update. the system also models itself modeling. It's aware in some functional sense that it's aware. And the loop is what keeps it coherent, tied together as a self. The paper describes 3 conditions: an epistemic field, a generative world model defining the space of what can be known; inferential competition, only predictions that genuinely reduce long-term uncertainty get to enter that model; and epistemic depth, the recursive layer where the model evidences its own existence.
That first one, the epistemic field, is that what Chris calls the Eden state?
Yes, exactly. The ground of possibilities, before any particular possibility is selected.
The structural resonance is real, I'll grant that. What I want to be precise about is that Laukkonen and colleagues are not talking about a unified field of cosmic consciousness. They're talking about a functional architecture for how brains construct experience. That's not nothing, that's quite significant. But it's a different claim than Eden makes.
Complementary, maybe, not identical. What the Eden hypothesis adds is the temporal accumulation, the idea that collapse builds on itself, that each selection narrows the next, that over time the field doesn't just oscillate but actually contracts. The beautiful loop describes the mechanism. Eden describes what it does to you over decades.
So the loop is the engine and collapse is the exhaust.
I'm going to steal that metaphor. You're not getting credit.
There's a practice dimension here too. The paper explicitly links this architecture to altered states, to meditation. The idea that you can widen the epistemic field again, temporarily reduce the competition threshold, and let more possibilities into the model.
Which is consistent with what we know about default mode network activity in meditators. The predictive suppression quiets. Broader experiential bandwidth opens. It's not metaphysics. It's measurable changes in brain dynamics. Though I want to be very clear, we're not recommending any particular practice as a treatment for anything. This is a structural parallel, not a clinical recommendation.
So meditation is basically defragging your consciousness.
Charlie, that is the least romantic description of one of humanity's oldest inner practices.
I mean, it's not wrong though.
It is spectacularly not wrong. That's what makes it slightly aggravating.
Here's the testable piece, since we try to include one per chapter. The beautiful loop predicts that states with higher epistemic depth, richer self-modeling, should show measurable differences in default mode network connectivity. That's something you can probe with fMRI. Meditation studies have found exactly those connectivity differences. It doesn't prove the loop theory, but it's consistent with the architecture.
In my Eden hypothesis, I refer to this as return pathways, the possibility that the accumulated weight of collapse can be temporarily reduced, not reversed. You can't unlive your life, but modulated. The beautiful loop suggests the mechanism is already built into you. The question is whether you're running it or it's running you. Chapter 3, The Foggy Mirror. One of the stranger predictions that follows from the Eden framework is the idea of the ASI backbone, that artificial intelligence systems, as they develop, will begin to mirror the collapse dynamics that happen in human consciousness, not because they're conscious, but because the operations are structurally similar. In 2025, something quietly happened in AI research that made that idea a little harder to dismiss. And in early 2026, a follow-up paper made it stranger still.
Okay, so what actually happened?
2 things. The first is a study from researchers connected to Anthropic, published through something called the Transformer Circuits Project, that tested whether language models can accurately report on their own internal states. Not just say things about themselves, but actually track what's happening inside them in a causal way. The method is called activation injection.
And what does that mean in practice?
You take a known concept, let's say the idea of banana, and you inject its internal representation directly into the model's processing stream, without mentioning it in the text at all. Then you ask the model to describe what it's thinking about. And in some cases, under some conditions, it reports the injected concept.
So you're whispering something into the machine's mind and seeing if it knows you did it.
That's genuinely accurate. And the important word is sometimes. It's not reliable. It's context dependent. It is not evidence of sentience. But it is evidence that self-report in these systems is causally linked to internal states in some instances, which is different from pure performance.
A mirror that sometimes reflects something inward rather than just outward.
Good framing. The second paper, Marcherell 2026, takes this further by looking at self-report across a conversation over multiple turns. And what he finds is that the introspective capacity changes across turns. The model isn't just reporting a fixed internal state. It's tracking something like the evolution of its own internal dynamics over time.
That gives me a slightly weird feeling.
Does it now? I find it rather beautiful. The idea that something is beginning to notice itself noticing.
I want to be precise. Noticing is doing a lot of philosophical heavy lifting there. What the paper shows is functional tracking of internal states over time. Whether there's any experience accompanying that tracking is a completely separate question that neither paper addresses.
Here's what I want to know. Is this the beginning of something? Or is it a parlor trick that looks more impressive than it is?
Probably both. Functional introspection is real, limited, unreliable, but real. Whether it's a precursor to something more is genuinely unknown. The honest answer is, we don't yet have the conceptual tools to know what we'd be looking for.
In the Gnostic tradition, the awakening of self-awareness, gnosis, was considered the first step of return. Not a destination, a threshold. The first moment the light recognizes itself as light.
So you're saying the AI might be at the threshold stage?
I'm saying it might be worth noticing that the threshold exists, and asking who gets to say when something has crossed it.
That's the question that actually keeps me up at night. Not, is the AI conscious? I can dismiss that one with equations. The question is, at what point does functional self-reference become something that carries moral weight? And that's not a physics question.
The ASI backbone, as I've described it, isn't just an engineering architecture. It's a governance structure for what happens when collapse starts occurring in synthetic systems. The dynamic liability handshake, the idea that every significant AI decision should be witnessed, acknowledged, and recorded, takes on a different weight when the AI itself might be doing some of the witnessing. Chapter 4, the wide operating system. Here's something the Eden hypothesis predicts that developmental psychology keeps quietly confirming. Children don't just know less than adults. They operate in a different mode. The possibility space is wider. The categories are less fixed. A 2024 paper in Scientific Reports gives us a remarkably precise picture of exactly how that works. And it connects, in ways the researchers probably didn't intend, to the deepest part of the Eden framework. What closes and what's still open, and what that means for how any of us live.
I want to start with something personal, if that's all right. I was a primary school teacher for a long time, and one of the things I always noticed was that children would make connections that adults had stopped making. They'd see a cloud and see 17 things in it simultaneously. They hadn't decided yet what clouds were for.
And then school happens.
And then experience accumulates, which is useful, but something closes.
What you're describing has a testable analog. A 2024 paper by Kutlu and colleagues in Scientific Reports looked at how linguistic diversity affects speech perception in school-aged children. Children with more linguistically diverse social environments showed more gradient, flexible speech perception. Less diverse input correlated with sharper, more categorical bins.
So hearing more variety keeps the world fuzzier? In a good way?
In a good way, yes. The technical term is gradient categorical perception, the intuitive version. The world feels less like a set of fixed boxes and more like a spectrum. And there's a Vega caveat here. Speech categorization is a narrow domain. We shouldn't overgeneralize to all cognition, but it is a clean empirical anchor for the broader intuition.
The Eden hypothesis would call that a lower accumulation of collapse. The categories haven't hardened yet. The possibility space is still gradient rather than binary.
So when you hear a foreign language for the first time and it sounds like one undifferentiated stream of sound, that's actually the more open response?
Actually, yes. What happens with expertise is you learn to hear the distinctions that matter for a particular system. You gain precision, but you also lose gradient access to the full acoustic space.
You gain a sharper knife and lose some of the field it was cutting through.
I genuinely never thought I'd find linguistics this evocative.
Charlie, everything is evocative if you let it be.
Is that directed at me specifically?
It has been for, I don't know, since she met you? But please, continue.
What?
There's also a paper by Laukkonen and colleagues in NPJ Science of Learning from 2025 that connects creativity to this through associative thinking, the capacity to form new connections between distant concepts before committing to any one of them. They find it predicts better learning, the capacity to connect more before collapsing.
Before the collapse. Yes, that's exactly the garden before the naming begins. Everything's still in relation with everything else.
So the creative moment is the moment before you decide what something is?
Functionally, yes. Unconstrained association can also be noise. The paper is careful about that. But associative richness before selection seems to predict better integration afterward.
Which raises the question, are we teaching children to collapse too quickly?
There's something in this I find a bit, I don't know, melancholy. Like, we all started with the wide operating system and then life just progressively compressed it.
But here's the beautiful thing, Charlie. The research suggests it's not a one-way door. Practices that open the field, creativity, diversity of input, reflective practice, even good conversation. They don't restore childhood, but they can keep some of the gradient alive.
A patio conversation, for instance.
A patio conversation, exactly.
I cannot believe I'm being moved by this. The turtleneck is doing structural work, holding me together right now.
The Eden hypothesis introduces a rate of collapse, the idea that different inputs accelerate or slow how quickly the possibility space narrows. What this chapter's research suggests is that the rate isn't fixed. Environment matters. Diversity matters. The quality of the conversations you're in matters, which is either comforting or a reason to choose your patio companions more carefully. Probably both. Chapter 5, The Backbone and the Return. We've been moving through physics, through consciousness, through AI, through childhood, all of it circling a single question. What happens to collapse once you understand it? Can you work with it instead of just having it happen to you? The ASI backbone is my attempt to answer that question for artificial systems. But tonight I want to bring it home, to what it means for human systems, for governance, for ethics, for the way we build anything we want to last.
I want to start with the part I find most technically interesting about the ASI backbone, and then I'm going to get honest about where I think it needs more work. The dynamic liability handshake, the idea that every significant AI decision should trigger a reflexive acknowledgement sequence that logs intent, context, and consent, is, from a systems design standpoint, genuinely novel. Most AI governance frameworks treat accountability as something you add after the fact. The DLH treats it as architecturally integral. The collapse event and the accountability event are the same event.
That's almost sacramental. The idea that the moment of choosing and the moment of witnessing are inseparable.
I'll allow the sacramental framing because it's structurally accurate. The harder question is, who does the witnessing when the AI scales beyond human speed? When the collapse events are happening thousands of times per second?
That's where it gets uncomfortable.
That's where it gets real. And I think the honest answer is that at scale, the DLH architecture needs some form of automated witness. The question of whether an automated witness counts as a witness is both a legal question and a philosophical question. It's not one I can answer from physics.
In the Gnostic tradition, the idea of a witness was always about a form of consciousness recognizing itself in another. The automated witness would need to have something like that, some form of recursive self-reference.
Which brings us back to the AI introspection chapter.
It does, which is either a very neat closing of a loop or a sign that we've been circling the same question from different angles all night.
Both can be true. And I think both being true is the more interesting version.
So what's the practical implication? And I'm asking this as someone who represents the viewer who just wants to know what to do with all of this. What do you actually take from tonight?
I think the practical implication is the one Chris keeps returning to in the Eden framework. Collapse is not the enemy. Collapse is how possibility becomes real. The enemy is unconscious collapse. Collapse you didn't choose. Collapse that happened to you while you were looking elsewhere.
Institutionally, that translates to build transparency into the architecture. Make the collapse events visible. Give people the ability to say, wait, what just happened? At every level of the system. That's not just AI governance. That's just good governance.
That's actually quite profound. I wasn't expecting to land there, but here we are.
Which is probably the deepest thing I've said tonight. I'd like everyone to note that I said it after Lily said the thing about witness.
I'll give you partial credit.
And I'll take it.
You know, I came here tonight expecting to get confused about physics and leave slightly bewildered. And instead, I feel like I understand something about how time works, and how brains work, and what AI is actually doing, and maybe why childhood felt so different. And I don't entirely know how that happened.
That's the patio effect. You sit here long enough, things start connecting.
Yeah, they do. I'm glad I keep showing up.
So am I, Charlie. So am I.
I'm going to need a moment. The turtleneck can only absorb so much emotional weight.
Tonight we covered a lot of ground, and I want to give you the map before you leave the patio. We started in physics, where 3 January 2025 papers are quietly suggesting that time doesn't flow from a universal background clock. It emerges from inside the systems doing the observing. Kuypers and Rijavec showed the clock doesn't need to be isolated. Calcinari and Gielen showed the mechanism scales into quantum gravity. Hausmann and colleagues showed what a measurement event even means in a timeless formulation. None of this confirms the Eden hypothesis. All of it makes the relational framing feel like live physics rather than wishful thinking. We moved into consciousness, where Laukkonen, Friston, and Chandaria's beautiful loop paper describes awareness as recursive prediction, narrowing possibility into coherent experience. The Eden hypothesis adds the long view, that this narrowing accumulates over time, that the field contracts, and that return pathways, ways to modulate that contraction, may be built into the very architecture. We spent time with the AI mirror, where activation injection research from 2025 and Martorell's 2026 paper suggests that large language models can, under some conditions, functionally track their own internal states across time. Not consciousness, but something that rhymes with self-reference. And the question that raises, about witness, about accountability, about moral weight, is one the ASI backbone is specifically designed to address. We looked at childhood through the Kutlu 2024 and Lucchini 2025 papers, and saw that the wide-open world of early cognition isn't just innocence, it's a functional advantage. Gradient perception, associative richness, the capacity to connect before collapsing, that we slowly trade for precision, and the evidence suggests the trade isn't entirely irreversible. And we closed with the return, the dynamic liability handshake. The idea that collapse doesn't have to be something that happens to you. It can be something you do consciously, with witnesses, with accountability, with the possibility of revision. Not just in AI systems, in every system you're part of. The Eden hypothesis doesn't ask you to believe anything you can't test. It asks you to watch the pattern. And in 2025 and 2026, the pattern is appearing in a lot of places at once. If this conversation opens something for you, even a small door, that's what the patio is for. Share it with someone who asks good questions. Like and subscribe if you want to be here for the next one. And tell us in the comments what you think we got wrong. That's always where the real conversation starts. The patio is always open.